Today we are going to look at Sam Adams' circular letter. This is lecture 10 in the Causes of the American Revolution series. And today you'll want to have a copy of the circular letter with you because I'm actually going to use this time to um, conduct a source analysis of the circular letter. It's a very important document for you to get your head around. And Sam Adams is a very important person um, in the American Revolution, in causing the American Revolution, and he's very prevalent in the whole narrative from start to finish. So you want to make sure that you get a full understanding of this, and to do so, I would definitely suggest getting a copy of the circular letter off the Google Classroom, downloading it, and annotating it as you see on the screen. And I'll explain it as we go. All right, just to touch base on last time, we looked at the seizure of the Liberty. This was John Hancock's ship, and it was seized because of the Townshend duties and the suspicion of John Hancock being a smuggler. Um, Ultimately, the consequences of this was not that great for Hancock. He ended up having to pay or being charged for smuggling offences, but it wasn't that great for uh, the customs officers in Boston either. One of them ended up getting beaten, another two got beaten, and their houses got trashed. So we see the beginnings of a rebellion, physical rebellion, and offense by both the Americans and the British in that event of the Liberty being seized. Today, we're going to look at the circular letter, and you want to be able to explain using the Massachusetts circular letter how Samuel Adams was a significant figure in the causes of the American Revolution. Just to uh, just to say again, Sam Adams, he's an important figure in this whole narrative. He's a part of your key knowledge, and you must know who he is. So pay attention today. A suggested reading for this is page 91 to 92 of your textbook. So not very long, but it will just give you a little bit more insight into what we're talking about today. All right, so who is Samuel Adams to begin with? He was born in Massachusetts, moderately wealthy guy, but most importantly, he's a writer and a journalist, and he's a speaker at rallies. He kind of becomes the propagandist of the American Revolution for the Americans. And we'll see that especially when we get to the Boston Massacre. His report of the Boston Massacre is very provocative, and it it it's not surprising why the Americans respond the way they do after reading Samuel Adams' account of that event. He's a member of the Massachusetts Assembly, so he's involved in politics, and he's been attributed by historians to be the creator of the Sons of Liberty. Um, like he was one of the guys who organized the protests against the Stamp Act in the first place. He's an enemy of Thomas Hutchinson, who's the governor of Massachusetts. So the two gentlemen live in the same place, and Sam Adams is a patriot and all for the Americans, where Governor Thomas Hutchinson is a loyalist to the Brits. And so naturally, two different political parties or political groups warring against one another, and Sam Adams and Thomas Hutchinson kind of become the figureheads of these two movements, especially in Massachusetts. Now, Sam Adams' circular letter was written pretty much after the publication of John Dickinson's Letters of a Farmer from Pennsylvania, which we've covered in class. And it's a response to the Townshend duties. So far, we've looked at many, many different ways that the British tried to enforce revenue acts on the Americans, and it ultimately climaxes to the Townshend duties introduced by Charles Townshend. The circular letter is a response to this, and it's called a circular letter because it was written with the intention of circulating through the colonies. And we've seen circular letters be introduced previously before this, and we've seen acts of colonial unity before this too, especially with the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress, acting as one united party to pretty much discuss with or argue with the British about the role of the Stamp Act. This circular letter was written with the intention of it being circulated throughout the rest of the colonies to pretty much act as a protest against the Townshend duties and likewise many of the other acts that came before it. Now, when I go through this, I'm actually going to read the letter or the part of the letter that I'm focusing on, and you're going to be able to follow this on your document too. And I want you to annotate as you see on the screen, but also put some stuff in your own words as I explain it. Actually draw out more than just what you see on the screen if you can. All right, so the circular letter is technically called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, and it reads, "The Massachusetts House have humbly represented to the Ministry their own sentiments, that King George is the supreme legislative power over the whole empire, and as the supreme legislative derives its power and authority from the Constitution. American subjects who acknowledge themselves bound by the ties of allegiance have an equitable claim to the full enjoyment of the fundamental rules of the British Constitution, that it is an essential, unalterable right in nature, engrafted into the British Constitution as a fundamental law and ever held sacred and irrevocable by the subjects within the realm, that what a man has honestly acquired is absolutely his own, which he may freely give, but cannot be taken from him without his consent." All right, so I'm just going to break this apart for you guys. What Sam Adams is trying to communicate here is the idea of republicanism, first of all. He's come out saying the Massachusetts House have gathered together and they want to convey these messages. First of all, King George, he's the supreme power in the whole empire, and that he's the supreme power because of the British Constitution. This was a document that was created after the Glorious Revolution. It wasn't a document. It's not technically written down, but it's an agreed upon social contract that is introduced following the Glorious Revolution of when King James is overthrown by the people. And we've covered what republicanism is already in this course. And this is what Sam Adams is trying to communicate here. The idea of republicanism, that he and the House identify the fact that King George is in supreme power, and he's in supreme power because of the Constitution that we have agreed to. He then goes on and brings up the idea of liberty. The fact that the Americans have a claim to the full enjoyment of their fundamental rules of the British Constitution, and they have a right in nature because of this. Pretty much he's arguing here that yes, we're Republicans, yes, we live in America, but ultimately we are British subjects. And because we're British subjects, we also should receive the same British rights as other Britons who live in Britain itself, right? So he's trying to communicate this fact that, we understand that King George is in power, but he's only in power because of the Constitution. And the Constitution says that any British subject is entitled to liberty. That's a right of nature. That's a natural right. And if that's a natural right for Britons who live in Britain, then it's also a natural right for all British subjects, including Americans. So that's where the theme of liberty comes up. And then he finishes by saying, what we've worked for in America, that is ours. We've worked for it honestly. It's our product. It's our property. And we can freely give it, but it can't be taken from us without consent. And this is where the idea of natural rights comes into play. And so Sam Adams very strategically introduces the circular letter by saying, the Massachusetts House understands that King George is in power, and we want him to remain in power. It's not a question of that. We want him to be there because the Constitution says so. But the Constitution also says that we also deserve specific natural rights. And one of those is liberty, and the other one is property. Okay. He continues, "It is, moreover, their humble opinion, which they express with the greatest deference to the wisdom of the Parliament, that the acts made there, imposing duties on the people of this province, with the sole and express purpose of raising revenue, are infringements of their natural and constitutional rights, because they are not represented in the British Parliament, His Majesty's Commons in Britain." And so this is Sam Adams' little bit of the circular letter where he actually brings up Townshend duties and the Stamp Act and all the other revenue acts that have been introduced so far. And he pretty much explains that there should be no taxation without our representation in the British Parliament. He brings up this idea again that was once the cause of the Stamp Act being repealed, and now the Townshend duties are being introduced, which are kind of like stamp taxes. And so he's using the same argument again. We should not be being taxed if we're not going to have an opportunity to represent ourselves in British Parliament. He continues, "This House is further of the opinion that the Constitutes, considering their local circumstances, cannot by any possibility be represented in the Parliament, and that it will forever be impracticable that they should be equally represented there, being separated by an ocean of 1,000 leagues, that His Majesty's royal predecessors for this reason were graciously pleased to form a subordinate legislature here, that their subjects might enjoy the unalienable right of a representation." And so here we see that the discussion of salutary neglect, something that we haven't talked about for a little while, but Sam Adams recalls it because it's an important thing that happened in America's history. The fact that they were sent to America and they were given the opportunity to rule by their own laws, and they were able to create their own legislatures within the colonies, and they were able to live in salutary neglect from Britain's crown or from the monarch or from King George. And that's what Sam Adams is trying to communicate here. He's trying to remind the Parliament that we were once able to represent ourselves because of the Constitution, because of our natural rights, because of liberty. You gave us that opportunity, and we used to live like this. And now all that's happening is you're introducing tax after tax after tax, and we're forever feeling like you guys are out to get us. He continues, "In addition to these measures, the House have written a letter to their agent which he is directed to lay before the Ministry, wherein they take notice of the hardships of the British Revenue Acts for preventing mutiny and desertion, which requires the Governor and the Council to provide for the King's marching troops, and the people to pay the taxes, from whence it may happen that officers of the Crown may be multiplied to such a degree as to become dangerous to the liberty of the people, by virtue of a commission, which does not appear to this House to derive any such advantages to trade as many have supposed." And so what Sam Adams is actually trying to communicate here is he's talking about the Sugar Act, Currency Act, and the Townshend duties. That these were introduced to prevent mutiny and desertion. The British Revenue Acts were introduced to prevent the Americans from trading with anyone else but the British. That's what the Townshend duties are trying to enforce. The Currency Act pretty much told the Americans that they weren't allowed to use colonial scrip. The Sugar Act tried to prevent the Americans from trading with the French West Indies. And so the British are trying to forever stop the Americans from being their own independent colony. But Sam Adams isn't challenging this idea. He's just making it known that he's aware of the British Revenue Acts trying to prevent mutiny and desertion. But what he continues to say is, all the king's done is put standing armies uh, in our colonies, and the idea of having a British army or a standing army in our colony makes us very anxious. We always feel like we're being watched and we're being judged. And the kicker of it is that we have to pay the expenses because of the Mutiny Act. We actually have to pay for the standing armies to watch over us. And so this is where the one of the key problems is for Sam Adams and for so many Americans is the fact that the king's standing armies or his marching troops are in America, and they're forever surveying and policing what the Americans are doing. And whilst they do that, the Americans actually have to pay for them to be there. And Sam Adams finally finishes this by just rehashing the fact that, yes, we understand British mercantilist policy. We understand, that we are indebted to Britain because we're colonists. So he's kind of challenging here the whole idea that of the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Townshend duties, the standing armies, the Mutiny Act, are they all really that necessary? Like, we understand that we are indebted to you through mercantilism, but he almost includes this little quip at the end saying that us people in Boston, we don't really know if there is much advantage to British mercantilist policy. Or maybe he's really saying here that maybe there isn't much advantage to, trying to prevent mutiny and desertion. There's not much advantage in the Sugar Act or the Currency Act or the Mutiny Act or the Standing Armies or the Stamp Act or the Townshend duties or anything, because so far, every time you've introduced something like this, we've just boycotted your British goods. We've stopped importing products, and it's forced you guys to back down. So maybe what he's really saying here is, maybe just check like that we're on board with this before you introduce it. We get the fact that we're under British mercantilist policy, but all we want you to do is communicate it with us a little bit better, as we're trying to with you right now. And so the circular letter brings up a lot of themes. It almost can be used as a summary for us so far. The cause of the circular letter is the Townshend duties, the fact that the Americans are being taxed on basic British goods such as tea and glass and paper that they use every day, and they don't want that to occur. And Sam Adams has seen this, and he's decided to act. The triggers are all the themes of republicanism in the British Constitution, liberty and natural rights, the idea of no taxation without representation, salutary neglect, which is also Enlightenment theory, because the Enlightenment said that people don't require God to live. They can be their own gods. And so that's what salutary neglect's trying to communicate. The British mercantilist policy, British Revenue Act, standing armies, and ironically, the monarchy. Sam Adams sees he sees the monarchy, and he's again humbly petitioning the monarchy to actually do what it says it's going to do in the British Constitution and stand up for the rights of its British subjects. And that's not what's occurring throughout the introduction of the Townshend duties. And so Sam Adams pretty much writes this circular letter with all these triggers. He's all these themes and ideas are popping up in his head, and he's thinking, something has to give, something has to change. And maybe if I get everyone on board with this, maybe we can petition the king, and we can again use our Republican voice to stand up and tell the king when he's overstepping the line. Unfortunately for Sam Adams, his plan doesn't really work. Lord Hillsborough, who's the Secretary for Colonial Affairs in Britain, works with King George III to do the following. He advises the Governor of Massachusetts, Francis Bernard, to dissolve the colonial assemblies. He then organizes troops in Boston and he forbids intercolonial communication through the use of circular letters. And these three acts are huge, huge consequences of the circular letter, because pretty much what Lord Hillsborough has done alongside King George is that he's shut down the ability for the colonies to communicate with one another and unite and act together. He has put actual armies on the doorstep of people in Boston, and he's challenging them by doing so. And he also shuts down the colonial assemblies in Massachusetts, and that is pretty much the colonists' way of acting politically. If they don't have that, then they don't really have any way to act in salutary neglect in the way that they used to. They don't really have any way for them to unite politically against the empire. And so these are three massive consequences of this circular letter. The king has pretty much ruled that enough is enough. You guys in Boston are starting to act way out of line, and I'm going to make sure that you guys do what I want you to do. I'm going to enforce it through troops. I'm going to shut down your ability to communicate. I'm going to shut down your political assemblies. And so we finally arrive to the Boston Massacre next time, where we see the actual act of Britons and Americans coming face to face in physical violence against one another. And it is another trigger of the American Revolution. It's kind of breaking the underlying silence that's going on underneath. The Americans for some time have really not liked the Britons, but are happy to be British subjects, and vice versa. The Britons are really not happy with the Americans, and so we get to this moment in time in American history called the Boston Massacre, and it's a fantastic little event that occurs. If you got any questions, please post them on the Google Classroom or bring them into class, and also bring in that document that's fully annotated and go further into it. I've only done a summation through those themes. I want you to go further into that document. It's really crucial. I hope I've communicated that to you today. All right.